Charles Loos.
How's the sound? I will. Sound? Good?
Can you hear it good?
Hello, hello? Is that good in the back?
Yep.
Okay. Get my little... Well, I had a whole introduction plan, but you know what? It's been a long COVID time, and I recognize a lot of faces out there, and it's really good to see you guys. It's really good to see you guys. Yeah, making the go or no-go decision. Who am I and why am I here? So as far as qualifications count, I grew up in Laguna Beach, California. I was in the water 5 days a week for 15 years straight. And so I've made all possible mistakes in the ocean. I've been trounced, bounced, and wiped out by every kind of wave there is. I've been launching little boats in the surf for 46 years. Back in the 90s, I was writing magazine articles for these magazines. I've been presenting sessions like this for about 11 years, and 3 years ago I started Ocean Coach, which is one-on-one coaching for small boat captains that want to go out in the ocean, cross the bar, and so forth. And I'm all about, and that's 19-year-old me doing stupid things with little boats and big sharks. This is me and my now wife. So I've been screwing around in the surf for a long time. So my mission is to help you become the captain everyone trusts, and I do that 4 different ways. Online digital courses, which is new for me. I'm announcing that today, and I'll talk about that a little later. One-on-one coaching, like I say, I've been doing that for 3 years. My free newsletter, which I get really good reviews. I encourage you to sign up because there's really good information in there. And free seminars and webinars like this. So how do you go from the forecast to a decision? Well, the first thing you realize is there's no app, there's no formula, there's no algorithm, there's no flowchart. You cannot pull up, hey Siri, is it safe to go out on the ocean out of Newport tomorrow? That doesn't exist. You have to study the ocean itself. There is nothing you can buy in this warehouse that'll help you make that go or no-go decision. It's not about gear. It's about knowing the ocean. Wind, swell, tide, and what is a bar, what does it look like, what are the physical characteristics of it. So what I teach, and it's very different than what the Coast Guard teaches. Okay, so the Coast Guard courses are great. You're going to learn anchoring, you're going to learn navigation, you're going to learn boat handling, you're going to learn about charts, you're going to learn about rules of the road, all that stuff, but it won't help you get across the bar. So I teach these 4 things, those 4 fundamentals, and we put it all together so you can make a good go or no-go decision. Okay, so we're going to go through this. This is going to be like drinking from a fire hose, okay? I can't give it all to you in 40 minutes. But wind is the most predictable, or unpredictable, of the 4 pillars that I teach. As you know, the wind forecast on this coast is really uncertain. And the reason is, the biggest wilderness in the world is the Pacific Ocean. There's not a lot of weather stations out there. So the poor forecasters trying to forecast the wind, they really struggle. It's not like sitting in Cincinnati where you've got land weather stations around everywhere you are. This is wind chop. You've all seen it. This is swell. This is wind chop, okay? So the thing about wind chop is when the wind blows, you get whitecaps. When the wind quits, the whitecaps stop. It's a local phenomenon. Swell is completely different. We're going to talk about that a little bit. But you've got wind chop and you got swell. very, very briefly, I like to say the fun stops at 12 knots of wind. I mean, even if there's no swell, somewhere around 12 knots of wind, the whole tone on the boat changes. If you've got 10 knots or less, there's no white caps. Everybody's happy. Nobody's scared. Even your brother-in-law from Kansas City who's never been on the ocean, they're fine. 10 knots is great. 15 knots, you've got big white caps. Most people really want to be home at that point. 12 knots is kind of the break point. You know, if you reach 12 knots, it's just not as much fun. And a lot of us, we do 12 knot winds all the time, of course. But it's going to be hard to tie a knot, rig bait, things like that. So what I tell people is think of that 12 knots as kind of a threshold. And I wish we had more 10 knot days on the Oregon coast. We just don't. So we're always kind of playing that game. And wind is the one thing, it's the easiest parameter to check in terms of your go and no-go. If it's blowing hard, you're not going. Pretty simple. Whereas tide and swell and bar crossing get a little more involved. So that's wind, real quick. And by the way, questions. If anybody has a question, please do. You have a question?
The wind north, south, east, or west? Which is the best or bad?
Let's hear it.
South.
It doesn't matter that much, but the south winds are a bear. The south winds. Go to my website and ask me, and I'll send you a handout on the south winds. South winds punch above their weight when it comes to making a rough sea. I'm not quite sure I understand why. And when it's a south wind forecast, that forecast is very, very unreliable. If they say it's going to blow southwest at 5 knots, don't be surprised if it's 15. So anyway, the question was, what wind direction makes a difference? South. They all said it. So anybody else have questions along the way, please do raise your hand. So swell is probably the most complex of the 4 pillars. Oops. I'm always going backwards. This is like watching paint dry, watching this video. But there's a lot here. Swells come in sets and lulls. The Coast Guard calls them a series. And, sometimes I make people watch this for 5 minutes so they get a sense of the sets and the lulls. It's an important part of swells. So this is a really interesting thing. Remember I said wind is created locally. When the wind blows, you get chop. When the wind stops, the chop stops. Swell is completely different. You need 2 things to create swell. You need wind blowing for several days over several hundred miles. Okay? Several hundred miles. This is a map, an old map. This is stormsurf.com, great site, but it shows the world's storms in real time. And so this is where our swell comes from. We got something going on off Japan, we got something going on in New Zealand, Gulf of Alaska. These are the great ocean storms that send swells to our coast. And once swell is created, it travels the world until it hits the beach somewhere. But you don't get swell without 2 things. Wind blowing for several days over several hundred miles. Which means swell cannot be created on lakes and rivers. It doesn't happen. There's no swell in the San Juan Islands. There's no swell in Puget Sound, other than some that leaks in through the inlet. All that stuff is wind chop, some variety of wind chop. Once in a while, the Great Lakes generate a little bit of swell, but it's not really much. So swell is just a totally different animal. So I just showed you 4 different storms or whatever sending swell to our coast. This is the NOAA forecast. It reduces the swell forecast to 1 line, 9 feet at 13 seconds. Pity the poor forecaster at NOAA. They have to take that reality and distill it down to that. And that is always a gross, enormous oversimplification. There are always multiple swell trains coming at us. Storms are being born, they're living, and they're dying. And to reduce it to that is just not especially helpful for the mariner. I do use this as a screening tool, but there are much better tools for determining swell. Okay. So yeah, swell continues without wind. Okay, swell period. Is that a familiar term to you guys? Yeah? Okay. So there's two measures of swell. One is the height, and that is the distance from the crest to the trough. That's fairly self-explanatory. The other one is the period. The period is the time from one swell crest to the next. It's not the distance. The distance is the wavelength, and engineers care about wavelength for radiation and light and radio and stuff like that. But we're talking about the time between crests. If you're sitting out on that oil well and you've got your smartphone on the stopwatch function and you look down and a swell crest goes by and you hit the button, and then the next time the crest goes by you hit the button again and you look at it, that's going to be 5 seconds or 8 seconds or 12 seconds or whatever. That's the period. And the period is as important as the height for a mariner because it's all about the amount of power in the swell. Any questions, comments, stories, complaints? No? Okay. So there's long period swell and there's short period swell. Short period is defined as the period is just a little longer than the height. 5 feet at 7 seconds is a short period swell. 10 feet at 12 seconds is a short period swell. Once you get into the period 2 or 3 times the height, that's a long period swell. So 5 feet at 10 seconds is a long period swell. 5 feet at 13 seconds is a long period swell. And there's a massive difference between the two. Which would you rather, let's say you're far out at sea, there's no wind. What would you rather be riding around in, a long period swell or a short period swell? Everybody said long. Well, that's because it's just a gentle hills rolling through, right? And when you're cruising, you're kind of loping up the slope and then back down the slope. It's nice. Short period swell, your boat's going bam, 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 one to the other. So from that point of view, you would want a long period swell, right? Well, I wish the ocean were that simple, but she's not. A long period swell has a massive amount of energy and power. A long period swell is a beast on the bar. So for your bar crossings, you want the short period swell, okay? Whereas a short period swell might peak up a little before it breaks. A 5-footer, 5-foot open water swell probably peak up to 7 feet before it breaks on the bar or on the beach. A 5-foot long period swell is going to peak up to 12 feet. So when you're thinking of your bar crossings, if the swell's long period, beware, because they're just powerful, big, powerful things. Did anybody remember back in April, we had a time here in Oregon with 3-foot swells. 3-foot swells, little guys. Every bar on the coast was closed because they were 3 feet at 16 seconds. Massively long period. And so, really, really quite a beast. There's one other difference between long period and short period swells. It has to do with wind. Anybody got any ideas? How would a long period swell respond to a sudden wind compared to a short period swell? Anybody got any ideas?
Well, I guess if it's a, let's say a swell come out of the west and it's east wind, that wind will hold the face up, wouldn't it?
Well, you're onto something. What it has to do with the short period swell has a steep face to it. And when the wind comes up, there's a lot for the wind to push against. And so with a short period swell, you get a sudden wind and it becomes a white cap mess really fast. Whereas a long period swell, it takes a lot longer. So there's pluses and minuses to long and short periods, but it's an absolutely crucial part of your planning. I wish you could just say one is better than the other, but it really isn't. So I have a 22-foot dory, flat bottom, slow surf launch boat. I love it to pieces. I kind of use this guideline for am I going or not, and yeah, you got to integrate this with tide and wind and all that stuff, but just for swell, 2 to 4 feet, that's as good as it gets in Oregon. That's pretty much a go for me. 7 feet plus, I don't think I'm going. Most bars are going to be closed. Maybe Newport might be open, I don't know. And if you start piling wind on top of 7 feet, it's not so good. But as you probably know, the forecast all summer long is right in that 5 or 6 foot range. And we're always trying to make that decision as to whether to go. If it's 6 feet, I'll probably go if there's a real light wind forecast, and if the tides are okay for the bar. If the wind's really blowing, it's got to be just right in there. That's kind of what I do. How does that square for you guys? Yeah? I got some heads. I saw familiar faces. I don't know your names, but
6 at 12, 6 at 14. I mean, that would be pretty nice. But 6 at 8, I don't know.
well, but remember, you're right, but remember the bar.
Right.
6 at 14 is a beast on the bar.
So look for the slack tide to cross.
All of that. That's the art of it, is stitching it all together, right? That's the difficulty. But you're right. Okay, tide. Thank God for tide, the most predictable of the 4 pillars. Oh my gosh. You can pull out the tide table and it will be accurate 10 years in the future. You can sit down and you can plan your summer vacation and your days off based on the tide. I'm really glad that's true. When it comes to bar crossing, there's a couple things going on. The obvious thing is high tide is better than low tide because the water is deeper and it's less likely to break. That's fairly obvious. And actually, the water depth on the bar tends to be sort of a secondary factor. But you probably know what the real problem is the ebb current fighting the incoming swell. So ebb means outgoing, the tide's going out. You've got current going out through the jaws, and it slams into the incoming swells, and it's ugly. That clash of forces, it really peaks up the swells. It makes the swells want to break. It just turns the bar into a washing machine. So it's really the interplay of swell and tide that are the problem on the bar. So what is ebb current? Water flowing downhill. That's all it is. So you've got high tide. This is the bay, this is the ocean, all right? Both are pretty high. The tide starts going out. All that means is the water level in the ocean's going down. That's all it means. Now you've got all this water in the bay pent up. It wants to run downhill. It wants to run to the ocean. Our bays are big, and the jaws, the space between the jetties is little. It's a nozzle. So that water has to all escape through that little nozzle to the ocean. That's all it is water trying to flow downhill. This is a ebb current in Newport's Bay. I shot this a couple of weeks ago. This is a pretty big tide. It's not a huge tide, but you can see the rapids right here. Just like you'd have in a river. That's just water running downhill. That's your ebb current. And there are days when there's no swell. If you have a big enough ebb current, the ebb current alone can be a problem for your boat. Yeah. Okay, now we're going to play some games here. So if it's the clash of the ebb current and the incoming swell that's the problem. The size, the speed of the ebb current is a big factor, right? The bigger the tidal span, the more water has to run out through that little nozzle, right? So we're looking at a tidal span on this day that goes from +8 to 0. So 8.5 foot tidal span. So 8.5 feet of water depth have to run out through that nozzle in 6 hours. That's a lot. That's a lot. Whereas on this ebb, look at this guy. You got 2.5 feet that have to run out in 6 hours. So the ebb current on that first one is going to be massively stronger than on the second one. And what I do with my coaching clients is I put these things up and say, is there a fishing day in here? When would you cross the bar and down and outbound? Well, look at that. We like to cross the bar at sunrise, right? Well, right here, you're in the middle of a massive ebb current. And if there's any swell running at all, you're probably not going to be able to get across the bar. And you're probably not going to be able to cross till low slack at about 11 o'clock. Well, that's not so great because that's when the winds start to come up. So that's probably not your very best fishing day. Now look at this one. It doesn't get any better than this for a bar crossing. You can cross at first light, at the bottom, at the low slack, and you can stay out till 1 p.m. That's high slack. You can certainly get in there, but that ebb in the afternoon is so tiny, it's probably not going to cause a problem on the bar. So you can come back whenever you can leave whenever you want. You can come back whenever you want. Beautiful, beautiful. Here's a real stinker. Don't take a day off on this day. Yeah, you can cross on the flood of about 7, but you better be back by that peak at, what is it, 10 o'clock. Because if you don't, you're probably not going to be able to cross on that big ebb. You're stuck. And you're stuck till basically sunset. So that's a real stinker of a day. Is this making sense? Questions, comments, stories? Okay. All right. And so on the West Coast, we have 2 high tides a day, and they're different heights. That's not true on the East Coast. On the East Coast, we have 2 high tides a day, and they're the same height. On the West Coast here in Oregon, we have about an 11-foot tidal span. But you go somewhere else in the world, you go to Hawaii, and it's a couple foot tidal span. You go to Puerto Rico, and it's a foot and a half, the tidal span. You go to New Jersey, and the tidal span is maybe 6 feet, maybe 8 feet. So everywhere you go, the tidal span is very, very different. We actually have pretty big tides here in Oregon. But there aren't a lot of bars in Hawaii, well, not this kind of bar anyway. But, you know, wouldn't really care about ebb currents in a place like that. We do in Oregon. Okay, so now we've talked about wind, swell, and tide very quickly. But we need to, when we make our bar crossing decisions, we need to understand, well, what are we dealing with? What is a bar? Where are the shallow spots? Why is it dangerous? This is the most stable of the 4 pillars. The bars don't change a lot. So, anatomy of a bar, this happens to be the Noosa bar in Queensland, Australia. And just to point out a couple of things, you see the shallows here? This semicircle of sand, that's a classic. You see that in bars all over the world. All that is river sediment that came down in the winter. Water's high, sand and mud comes screaming down the river. This is a river inlet like that. It hits the ocean, the current dissipates, and the sand falls out. So this apron of sand here is what causes the shallows. And you'll notice the jaws, and by the way, people go out of this bar all the time. The jaws are pretty deep. The problem is always a few hundred yards out. That's one way a bar is shallow. And this is an aerial view of Newport Bay, Google Earth. And you can see that same semicircular structure where the water is shallow. And this is a bar, I don't know exactly where it is, but you can see that same semicircular thing. But there's another one, another mechanism for causing shallows that's absolutely huge in the Pacific Northwest. You see this semicircle of sand here? That is not river sediment. That was created by longshore drift. So imagine the swells coming from the northwest breaking on a sandy beach. After the swells break into waves, there's still a little bit of southbound velocity. And if you're standing in the water at the beach knee deep, maybe you might notice a wake coming off your legs going southbound. That frothy water has a tremendous amount of entrained sand in it. And it's a sand conveyor belt. And so that sand flows down the coast until it hits a bay mouth and then it drops out. And we get this. That's how we get our sand spits. Right here. Huge factor in the Pacific Northwest. Doing pretty well on time. Questions? Okay. This is a chart of Tillamook Bay. And you can see the two types of shallows. You see the pink here? That's that same semicircle finger of sand that we keep seeing. And that hook thing, that's the longshore drift. Now Tillamook has short little jetties that are poorly maintained and they don't dredge it. So we see some of that natural shoaling still surviving. Okay, and jumping ahead, Newport has longer jetties and they dredge it. So we really don't have the shallows like we do in most bars. So everything I said about bars is about natural bars, but if the jetties are good and they dredge it, you kind of get away from that. That's why Newport's so much an easier bar. Oh, going the wrong way. So this sand spit phenomenon. The Columbia River bar, taming that bar was the battle of the sand spits. You can look at it that way. This is 1885. That's a chart of what the Columbia River bar used to look like. Okay? So you have this massive spit up here, right? Peacock spit and classic spit, right? With barely a channel in between. So the engineers in the 19th century said, we got to fix that. And so they started putting jetties in here. 1895, they put in the South Jetty. And I want you to know, you've all been to Fort Stevens? Fort Stevens was right on the water. Of course it was. Where else would it go for? So they start putting these jetties in to try and tame those two spits, right? 1950, they completed most of the jetties. They've tamed Peacock Spit and Classic Spit. Fort Stevens is now a long way from the water because those jetties have built up so much sand. So the Columbia River was the battle of the spits. And that's why those two spits are so darn dangerous, because nature wants them to be there. And they are ever changing. And lots of boaters get in trouble trying to cut the corner on those two spits. But they are powerful creations of nature and they want to be there. So you Columbia River guys, as far as I'm concerned, I stick to the channel. I'm not cutting corners. Going around the corner on that. Okay. All right. So here's the crux. I created this graph out of experience. It happens to be for Tillamook Bay. Don't take it as gospel. The numbers don't matter, it's the concept that matters. Along the horizontal axis, I've got swell height. Along the vertical axis, I've got the probability that the bar is going to be open as a percentage. And what I'm trying to get at is this is where we have to put it together, okay? You've got the swell, the higher the swell, the worse the bar. You've got the tide. The bigger the span, the stronger the ebb current, the less chance the bar is going to be open. We need to put this together. So this graph is an attempt to do that. So let me just walk you through it. So the blue line, this line here, that is best case conditions, high slack, okay? High slack means the water's deep, which is good. The water's not moving in or out, which is good. Just the trivial case, if the swell is 3 or 4 feet, the bar is going to be open. You know, it's not a big deal. If the swell is 7 or 8 feet, the bar is going to be closed. The interesting part is the 5 and 6 foot range where we see so many forecasts in the summer. So what I'm saying here is with a 5 foot swell, 5 foot swell at high slack, best case conditions, the chance of the bar being open is pretty good. Let's call it 95%. Even with a 7 foot swell, the chance of the bar being open is about, I'll call it 30%. Under best case conditions, okay? The red line is worst case conditions, the strongly ebbing low. Okay, so it's close to low tide, the water's shallow, and it's running out fast. That's the worst case condition. So let's go back to our 5 foot swell. So 5 foot swell, 90% chance of it being open under best case conditions falls to 35% under worst case conditions. And that's the game we all play, right? That's the game we all play. 6 foot swell, you've got a 70% chance of getting through under good conditions, 15% chance of getting through bad conditions. This is the game. And does this make sense? If you get this, you get a lot. Yes?
Is there some place that we can see a forecast of the flow? The flow is what determines what will happen.
Did everybody hear that? That's such a good question. He asked if there a place you can find the ebb current, the flow. Yes and no, and I want your guidance on this because all your chart plotters have tidal current tables built into them, right? You can pull it up and it'll give you a nice little arrow of what time, whatever time you want, the direction of the current and the speed, right? I don't know if you've used it. And then there's a site called deepzoom.com that'll do the same. Okay, so you can go and you can look at a tide station in the Columbia River and you can see at a certain time you're going to get this much ebb current. I don't find them to be really accurate. I don't know. Have you guys tried that? Anybody have problems with that?
I've tried Deep Zoom and I had quite a bit of problems with it.
You've had a lot of problems with it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I have too. I for whatever reason, it's squirrely. So
I was in a tour of the Coast Guard building here
yeah.
years ago. And they, in their, whatever you want to call it, center where they've got all the radios,
Yeah.
they have big screen TVs. Across the bottom of it was flow.
Oh.
But I don't know where I can find that information that we can see it without going in their office and saying, let me look.
If you find it, let me know, because that would be great. That would be great. But he brings up a great point. Great point. I'm going to set this aside for now because this is such a great question. There is a time delay between published high tide and the time the water actually stops moving. Have you noticed that? High slack is at noon, says the tide table, but you get there and it's still ebbing. It's still ebbing for another 15, 20, 40 minutes. There is a time delay in a lot of bays between published high or low tide and when the water actually stops moving. What's going on? Well, that giant bay is trying to drain through the nozzle and all that water just can't get out fast enough. So that's what that time delay is. And rather than use deep zoom or the tidal current tables. I kind of, for each port, just kind of throw in a number. Like Tillamook, it's like 20 minutes or so. Newport, I don't know, what do you think? Newport, 30 minutes? Yes, maybe?
Yeah,
15, 20, somewhere in there.
It rained all last week, so there's so much more water coming down.
You said, what about the rain? And that's why these tidal current charts are wrong, because they don't, I don't say wrong, but if it rains a lot, there's a lot more water moving, and that affects it. Or if Bonneville opens the gates in the Columbia River. So you're right, you're right. Good catch. Okay, so if it's a 6-foot swell under bad conditions, you're probably not going to get in. And you probably are going to get in on good conditions. So this is the doggone game we always play. Because we want to plan our bar crossings for flood tides, flat tides, and avoid the ebb tides. And this is how people get stuck outside, you know. It's kind of a common mistake to get down there and you think, okay, the Coast Guard has opened the bar, great. That means we're good to go all day. No. The Coast Guard may know darn well that the bar is going to close in an hour because of a tide change. It's up to you to determine, can you actually get back. This is an important one. Are we getting this? Okay. All right. As far as forecasts go, I really like windy.com. It's free. You can get it on your phone. You can get it on your computer. I prefer the computer. And you can even pay a few bucks for a premium product. But remember the NOAA? It has a swell forecast. 5 feet at 13 seconds, that's all they tell you. This is so much richer. First of all, you get 2 swells, right? They show you the primary and the secondary, which is really much more realistic to what's actually going on out there. And look what you get. This is 3-hour intervals off into the future. You get wind speed and direction in knots. You get swell, height, and direction. Okay. And you get swell period. So this is a much better tool, windy.com. All right, we're almost done. This is your checklist. Okay, 5 fingers. These are the conditions you have to satisfy yourself will be okay as captain. Bar crossing outbound. Sea conditions when you're out there. Visibility. Bar crossing inbound and the forecast trend. Okay, that's your checklist. So, I've blitzed through this stuff and I'm almost out of time. I'm at 37 minutes. But in coaching people, I have found it takes 6 hours of instruction, 2 hours of homework, and some Q&A to get people from that state of overwhelm, like, I don't understand how to plan bar crossings, to I get it, okay? I am announcing a new product for Ocean Coast today. It's an online digital course, not just the one-on-one coaching, but pre-recorded. You can work at your own pace. And maybe you're tired of trying to piece this stuff together on your own. I can help you get through this, either through one-on-one coaching or this online product, which I'm pretty excited about. Oh, by the way, that's my boat record, 42-pound tuna. I didn't catch it, but anyway, I'm kind of done. So, the Coastal Mariners Masterclass. You can sign up online. It is 8 modules. It'll take you about 4 weeks. I'm including some twice weekly Zoom calls for Q&A. Anybody who signs up, we all go through it together. We finish in 4 weeks. Lots of Q&A. And it's all about making the go or no-go decisions using a huge expansion of everything that I've talked about. So, if you are interested in the class, it's oceancoachclass.com. And I've got that on little handouts. If you want to see this presentation again, I'm doing 2 webinars online this week. That's sort of an expanded version of what I've done today. And if you want my newsletter, it's theoceancoach.com. So that's my pitch. Questions? Yes?
The place where you find fog information.
Oh, darn it. I wish. Windy.com has it. I don't know how much I trust it. The NOAA forecast has it. I don't know how much I trust it. Does anybody have a reliable fog forecast?
Well, depends.
Who said that? Say it louder.
Yeah.
Right? You said if it's hot in the valley, it'll be foggy.
Hot in Portland, north of Neocony, it's gonna be foggy north.
Right?
Get south of Neocony, it's clear as a bell.
Any other questions? Yes?
About currents. Is there something that's, we can find on currents in the ocean?
From a navigation and safety point of view, tidal currents in the ocean don't generally matter. Okay? They matter on the bar. I do not know of a source that will tell me what the ocean currents are. Sometimes they're ripping, sometimes they're not. I haven't figured that out. Anybody else? Okay. I think I'm done. Come see me, talk. Thanks, everybody.